I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Ben Kaplan, CEO and founder of Top Global, for today's webinar, Crisis Marketing, 7 Ways to Grow Your Business in a Downturn.
Great, and thank you, Jackson. And actually what I'd like to do is make sure we're in kind of the right split screen mode, and everyone to start off with can control that. So the topic, I'm going to share my screen right now, is crisis marketing, and specifically what we want to do. And here we go. I'm sort of in shared screen now. And what we want to do is specifically look at how can we actually grow our business in a downturn, not just survive, but how can we actually thrive? And one of the things that I always like to say, and if I kind of go into kind of full screen mode here, is be careful with who you take advice from, but be patient with those who give it. And so kind of 3 or 4 quick slides and just our perspective as we look at crisis marketing and how we think about the world, a few different things. A few things about how we work. So in a prior career, long time ago, I actually launched a book in a crisis. It was actually around the dot-com bubble. I was the author long before I started agencies of a book called How to Go to College Almost for Free. And it was all about finding families we could help in a crisis pay for college. And so learned a ton about how do you sort of engage people? How do you solve a pressing need? How do you make your product relevant to what's going on? So that was a long time ago, number 1. Number 2, previously in different crises, I actually was a pitch trainer in a program called Startup Chile, and actually helped launch companies in all sorts of different kinds of economic, like either success times or crises times in countries all over the world. So learned a lot about how do you gain traction for something that doesn't have brand awareness in a crisis. And third, in terms of our top agencies now, we are a global agency network. We have agencies that run the spectrum from creative agencies like Top Agency, or vertical specific agencies like Top Health or Top Finance or Top Education. Agencies that do interesting things with data and thought leadership like Top Data. Digital marketing agencies that convert Top Digitals. These are all kind of different ways that we explore. And right now, we just think it's an opportunity for the right types of companies to be doing what normally would take 3 years, you can do in 3 months, if you know how to kind of like maximize the opportunities in a crisis. And then finally, in terms of PR Hacker specifically, PR Hacker is one of our agencies that specifically focuses on high impact PR and specifically focuses on crises. We're a combination of 40 full-time, 40 part-time. We're based in Austin, San Francisco, New York, and London. And we do a lot with digitally innovative ways to leverage PR beyond what is typically a PR firm would do. And here are some of the sort of clients on the startup side and the larger side. So the heart of this presentation is 7 ways to grow your business in a downturn. And specifically, we're going to talk about 7 opportunities that I think we have now to not only survive, but thrive. As a precursor to this, if you've attended some of our other webinars, we've looked at number 1, what are the lessons from the past 4 financial recessions of how to pivot, not pause your business? Number 2, we looked at how to become a thought leader in a crisis, and specifically, what are the mechanisms of thought leadership? And then 3, one of the characteristics of the top 9% of companies in a crisis is they overinvest in marketing compared to their competitors. One of the hallmarks of the past 4 crises. And so what this presentation is specifically looking at how do you, what are the types of marketing that you should invest in? So first point and first opportunity is, in a crisis, build credibility via social proof. One of the opportunities in a crisis that we have is that the table is reset. 85% of market leaders who enter a crisis are no longer the market leaders after a crisis, right? 8.5 out of 10 change. So as a result, there can be a whole new group of companies, of brands, of organizations who suddenly can emerge. And so part of that, if you want to be one of those companies that emerges, or you want to take over a market leadership position from a current maybe competitor that you face, is that there's an opportunity to build credibility and simply by doing it by social proof. So here's 3 ways to do that. Number one, we look at a high quantity of media mentions to show, at a regular cadence, to show widespread reach. So we can do this through PR. What we're constantly doing with our clients, and you can do this on your own, is how do we generate different angles on stories to be relevant to lots of different types of media, lots of different types of beat reporters, and do it on a quantity basis. But at the same time that we do that, number two, let's target top tier publications that offer prestige and a substantial halo effect to our brand. So on a quality basis, what's interesting during a crisis is that the go-to experts, the go-to thought leaders, it gets all mixed up. The usual suspects are no longer the usual suspects. And the question is why? Well, it's a whole new set of circumstances in a crisis. So for instance, here's an example of something we did. For Top Data, one of our agencies, we actually produced a report that on what was to add color to the unemployment issue during a crisis, how many new jobs are being created. And to do that, we actually used data from Indeed's API, just looked at how many jobs are being, new job positions as a leading indicator that are being posted each week. And then we became a thought leader just looking at, for top tier publications, looking at what is the other side of unemployment? Where are new jobs potentially being created? And we can tell this through job postings. So suddenly we're able to get top tier media coverage simply by using data in an interesting way. And we'll talk about that. So target top tier publications that offer a halo effect to our brand. And then three, align social proof efforts to key industry verticals that match our sales goals. So one of the hallmarks of a crisis is everyone tends to become more performance oriented, right? It tends to be marketing has to sit a little bit closer to sales. We've got to be a little bit more concerned about what is the ROI from every activity that we're generating. So if you can also target industry verticals and ones that you want to target, we'll talk about how to do that in a little bit. There can be social proof for that if you're targeting energy, if you're targeting financial services, if you're targeting professional services or real estate or biotech. How do you then also have an opportunity? And the whole idea here is that essentially the go-to experts, thought leaders, people who are quoted for newspapers, those who are featured on TV on CNBC's latest segment on Squawk Box, all of that tends to be reset in a crisis because it's a whole new set of circumstances. Lots of the traditional players, like big companies that would be on those shows, they're in disarray. Marketing, departments have been cut. Layoffs and furloughs have happened. There's a lot of uncertainty, so we need more types of information. So it's a resetting of the deck. So if you've been like, okay, it would take us 3 years to reach this level, in 3 months, you can do it now. Okay? Here is an example, another example of how we do that. We call it geo-ranking. And so we have 27 different blueprints at PR Hacker. And we look at, can we make geographically relevant news to national, regional, local media, because media is organized geographically, and that's another way to generate that kind of social proof at scale. Here's a few examples of how we create headlines for that. So this is a real headlines that we've pitched or placed here. Boston ranked number 4 in the world for venture capital funding of synthetic biology. So this was a synthetic biology ranking. You can imagine certain fields right now would be hot fields in the current pandemic. How do you make that relevant? Or here's another one for a bold ask question, another one to be relevant to the media by asking a bold question that makes us seem more noteworthy or newsworthy. For Business Insider, will this startup save 100 million lives by 2025? In the current pandemic, obviously, we're very cognizant about what is the effect on health, wellness, and human life. These are the kind of headlines that you can run to show your relevance. Or holiday, another blueprint we have, which is the relationship of data related to a holiday. Here's one we did for Mother's Day. Red Eye Mommy, 52% of moms have stayed up late with their kids proofreading a paper. This is for a client that has a homework solution all around the world for parents. We want to spotlight for Mother's Day their role in education. So these are all different ways. Disease is another one. For CNBC, cyber attack unawareness disorder. 25% of tech companies don't know if they were breached. Here's another example of a headline, very relevant for right now because everything is moving digital and remote work. But suddenly, as a result, there's a lot of cybersecurity threats and risks, hence all the news about Zoom related to Zoom bombing and everything else. So here's another way that we can be relevant. So for all of this, we often write 8 different versions of a headline. We A/B test which performs the best. And this is the first way that you can be relevant right now, have a halo effect right to your brand, and PR becomes a powerful channel in that. And Jackson, how are we doing so far? Any other thoughts, comments, questions, either from the group, or I know you kind of field a lot of like inbound email and everything else that we talk about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the questions I'd ask here is when we're kind of looking at these blueprints, Ben, I know that frequently it's not like we'll just kind of take one version of that blueprint. And I see here we're kind of on this slide about A/B testing, but could you dive a little bit deeper into what that A/B testing looks like and kind of how our attendees can apply that to their own outreach?
Sure. I think one of the things and one of the key aspects of this is basically running different versions of a headline, different versions of a pitch based on who the audience is, what their interest is, and testing that first. So we will often do groups of media outlets, maybe 100 at a time on the local level, and look at, let's do version A of this pitch. Then we'll do another version with version B. And we'll basically, before we pitch the New York Times on it or the Wall Street Journal, we'll actually test it on smaller media outlets first. So that's one of the key things there as well. So now that we've looked at that, let's jump back in and look at the second sort of way that we can market effectively in a crisis times. And that is to warm up cold leads, So this is a time when a lot of times for a lot of companies, like hot leads go away. And I'd love to, actually know, what is this? Who are, for those of you attending today, what kinds of industries are you in? If you go to the chat room, and hopefully everyone can type now, I think in the chat room. So give that a try. What kind of industries are you in? Are you in B2B? Are you in B2C? Who do you focus on? And how are your leads at the moment? But let's talk about warming up hot leads during a crisis. So here's a question for everyone, and Jackson or Joe, what do you think on this too? And everyone else, how many LinkedIn posts have you done in the past 30 days? How many do you think you should do? And we're talking like company-wide. Jackson, do you have an answer to that? Do you know?
Oh yeah, for me, it's not nearly enough. Ben, I know that you've got a much more robust LinkedIn presence than I do, but it surprised me when we've been talking about this, just how high a frequency we have to have in order to have like a real meaningful LinkedIn presence.
Sure, and then this is company-wide, but one of the opportunities on how to warm up cold leads right now is there's a couple things working in our favor. Number one, across all of our digital marketing across the world, during the pandemic, we're seeing an increase of about 50% in open rates for like email open rates. So that's significant, right? If you can be like, okay, of all of the normal emails that you send out to potential leads, 50% more will open them up now. One, that's significant. So that means there's substantial people online. Two, click-through rates, whether that's email or like social media posts, like if you're a B2B company on LinkedIn, those are up, it depends on the industry, but about 60 to 80% overall right now. So people are clicking through more. Those factors, combined with the fact that LinkedIn, unlike Instagram or unlike Facebook, basically will give you more audience the more you post. They won't penalize you for posting more and not getting engagement. So there's an opportunity now that if you're a B2B company, and if you're not posting, and I don't mean necessarily like one person has to post or just a company account 10 times a day, but across your company, if you're not posting at least 10 times per day, you're missing out on basically the golden age of LinkedIn, and you're going to regret that. So that's one way to stay top of mind. And here's an example of what this looks like in terms of right now. Basically, LinkedIn is the equivalent of Facebook, kind of 2012 to 2016, Instagram, 2014, 2017. LinkedIn right now is kind of this golden time. So here is another strategy for warming up cold leads and why it's important to do that, and how you can do that on LinkedIn in a crisis time. We call it a LinkedIn INCEPTION program. What it is essentially targeting a very small group of people with ad buys. Sometimes it's on LinkedIn, it's oftentimes as few as 100 people. LinkedIn is an expensive ad platform, but it's also one where because it's performance based, it's based on like sort of they're clicking on a link. If they don't engage, it won't necessarily have a lot of cost. And can you enter the social media feed of your targets and keep them sort of apprised of what you're doing? What happens is that those high value folks often don't realize that you're targeting. So what we're not doing is the kind of retargeting ads where it's like, man, it follows you all around the internet. Clearly, oh shoot, I clicked on the site, and now everywhere I go, like even on personal sites, I'm getting like ads for this. It's a little bit more savvy than that, but can we have a program for our important cold leads or important leads that we need to target that basically enters their news stream on a regular basis? And because it is so targeted, the ad buy doesn't necessarily need to be super big or expensive. And so what happens is when we emerge from a crisis and suddenly deals are happening more, opportunities are happening more, those companies that overinvested in marketing and staying top of mind see an influx of new business like in Q3 or Q4 this year by doing things like this. Okay, so LinkedIn can be very helpful in terms of creating lead awareness, just making them aware of you, projecting an enhanced image, projecting something maybe skate to where the puck is, not just where skate to where the puck is going, not just where it is. And third, supporting a lot of different partnership deals as well. So that's the second way. So we talked about using mass media as a channel. We talked about staying mind and warming up cold leads, using now LinkedIn and social as a channel. Brings us to number 3, become a category leader, become a category thought leader. One of the opportunities in a crisis and is to become a source of truth in your industry. And one of the fastest way to do that is using data. And the reason sort of data-driven content marketing, which is powerful for thought leadership, is because it gives you an immediate monopoly on information that if it's valuable, no one else has. It makes you important. So maybe your market position is not, you're not the number one and most important company in the market yet. Maybe your role in a company, maybe you're not the CEO of the company. But if you have valuable data that is valuable to other companies, to other CEOs, to other people, then suddenly you're incredibly important. People have to come through you. So data is an accelerator of your brand position because it gives you control of something that if it's good data, if it's packaged well, everyone else wants it and they have to come through you to get it. So here's an example of a third strategy in a crisis for crisis marketing of how to create data-driven news. One, you leverage a timely news bag. Of course, there's the crisis itself, the current pandemic, and also a lot of the unrest and protests around, in cities in the US and around the world. But within that, there's different news pegs. So maybe there's new unemployment data. Maybe there's new, news about cybersecurity risks for certain platforms. Maybe there's news on a new government rule or law. Maybe there's news by, what the IRS or Small Business Administration is doing with new, kind of loan forgiveness options for small business. There's all of these little bits of news. And the biggest mistake people make when they do like a data program is that they don't focus on what's the current conversation now. They'd be like, okay, let's do data on XYZ. Let's release it when it's done and let's just promote it instead of looking at how does it follow news peg. So that's number one. Then you create a data study related to that news peg, and study is a little bit of a high bar. We do a lot with very quick data comparing numbers on Google Trends and what are people searching for. We turn that into some data. We do quick little pulse surveys. So it doesn't have to be a huge reach. At Top Data, we're often doing at that agency data programs for clients that are done within a couple days, right? These aren't huge lifts because we're trying to create a lot of data and test and learn from it. So create a data study. Third, post it on your website. Why? There needs to be kind of a location that people can get to for it, but it also leads to a couple other things, which are 4 and 5. You can pitch that data story to mass media. We talked about that in strategy 1, and the media will link to the full study. This is a powerful link generating strategy. And by the way, if you are doing SEO or search engine optimization, or would like to do it, now is a fantastic time for that. Why? Lots of marketing departments have been cut. People are taking their eye off the ball of the competitive sort of set for SEO. So we're seeing gains all over the place for ourselves and our clients. So the benefit of data in terms of a media link is that it has two qualities that lends to links. One, if you're citing data, especially if you're media, you have to cite where it's from. So citation is a link. So data lends itself to citations. Second thing is that usually if you're media, you have to summarize it. You can't go into everything in data, but you don't have enough space. You don't have enough time. So if you're summarizing data, and it makes natural sense to give people more of it if they want to learn more. So that's the link as well. And finally, number 6, you get inbound traffic from the link, but you also get, it's the fastest way to increase your SEO. So as you do this and you look at data, here's a few specifics on it. So one, we talked about identify windows of opportunity. And Jackson, I see you look like you have a question or a thought there.
Yeah, one question that I know we frequently encounter, Ben, is, I can pull together a white paper, I can pull together a study, but it's expensive, it's time consuming. And frequently, if I just have like a white paper up on my site, right? Like if I have all this data, I've taken all this time to package, like maybe it takes off, maybe it doesn't, but how can you kind of maximize the value so that all of this data that was very sort of, potentially time consuming to produce, isn't just going stagnant somewhere?
Right. Well, I think one big thing on that is that as you produce something, there should be multiple ways to utilize it, right? So it's not just like sort of make something, do this big effort, and then it's sort of done. But how do you have, like, if you're making a big data push, how does it power what you do throughout the year? Let me give an example. You often will do data, and then you can do later versions of it for different segments. So let's say we do our big report on, I don't know, the state of remote work, which would be, a timely topic right now. Then we do like the state of remote work for B2B companies, the state of remote work for millennials, the state of remote work for women. So all of that can come from that same push, but it can be pieced out in different ways. So the biggest mistake people make with data is that they make a monolithic report. It's too big. And instead, you can have like a core report, but then you can have versions of that for different audiences, different verticals. Here is remote work for financial services. Here's remote work for professional services. Here's remote work for technology. Here's remote work for education, right? We can do all of those different versions. So I think it's helpful to do that. So identify windows of opportunity. 2, gather data for each time window. We use many different data sources. So that includes created data, public data, digital data, brand data. I mentioned we use the Indeed API, Indeed.com, to have job-related data. We use Google Trends to compare search volume on different things. We did something called like the Pandemic Stress Index to look at which cities were the most stressed out. Internal data, how do we package it? How do we package it in new ways that others can consume it? If you look at government data, we can aggregate it in different ways and make it useful. So these are all different ways that we can gather data for different time windows. And then the key here is, how do we connect data back to brand benefits? So what I encourage you to think about is, what is brand benefit number 1? Number 2, what is your unique selling proposition? Each data point should ladder to that. So if your unique selling proposition, if you're a remote work company, is that it is simplicity and ease of use, right? You can just be working remotely very, very easily without a lot of training. If that is your brand benefit, then your data point could be, what % of people in this industry are frustrated or have a pet peeve or around the complexity with trying to do a video conference, for instance, or something else, right? So the point is that you don't just do data for the sake of data. You connect it to your specific value proposition each point. And as you do that, you can segment by geography, industry vertical, use case. Those are all ways that you can segment and be relevant to your target market. So don't just wait for news to happen. Use data to create the news. So what have we learned so far? We've seen 3 different channels for crisis marketing. We saw leveraging PR in a really scalable way. We talked about using blueprints and doing that to be relevant and using it for a halo effect, specifically on having social proof with high quantity, quality, and relevance of your PR. We also talked about leveraging social. In particular, we highlighted LinkedIn as a real opportunity. Social engagement, digital engagement is through the roof right now. It's a great opportunity. LinkedIn is underutilized. 3, we talked about content marketing, big advantage, and particularly data-driven content marketing right now, because Anytime we're in an era where there's a lot of uncertainty, data helps bring more certainty. And if we have the data, we become more important. If we have valuable data, we become valuable. That brings us to point number 4. Unseat a tough competitor. So here's a question. Here's something we get. This was from an actual client, a new client deck when we did the analysis. Does your share of voice look like this? Like us, small, them, a lot. And share of voice just means, of the total conversation on a topic that we want to be a part of, what percent involves us and what percent doesn't involve us. So here is a way to immediately increase in a crisis your share of voice. We call it the slingshot. And the little picture there shows a spaceship slingshotting around a competitor. Essentially, let's look at our competitors, our partners, and we're going to look at a few more other groups for what is their share of voice, who are the journalists or influencers covering them, and how do we create a program that if they're being covered, they will instantly hear for us. We call this a rapid response program. We do this for the vast majority of our clients. Basically, if a competitor is mentioned, it's good news for us because we're going to piggyback on their story. So here's an example from a recent client deck. This was dealt with sort of, a client we were working with on business kind of visualization and data visualization. So some of their competitors include Tableau, Click, and Click Data. These are their mentions in a recent year. That's 10,000 opportunities to insert ourselves in their conversation. And that's highly relevant during a crisis because basically there's going to be a reshuffling of the market leadership. Like I said before, past 4 economic crises, we're talking about the 2008, the Great Recession, 2000, kind of circa 2000, 2001, dot-com bubble, also 1990, 1980 declines. Basically 85% of market leaders entering those were not market leaders when we emerged from them. So real opportunity here. So if you can slingshot around your competitors, it's an opportunity to reshuffle the deck. Second, Goliath. And specifically, let's look at the Goliath companies, the large players, the Apples, the Samsungs, the Facebooks, the General Motors. What news are they creating? Can we insert ourselves into their news? So the way media works, those large companies have beat reporters that just cover them. There is someone assigned at major publications to cover Tesla and Elon Musk. If we're not Tesla, we're not Elon Musk, they might not cover us. But if we can add insight into news from Tesla or news from Elon Musk, then suddenly they'll cover us and they'll feature us. So thinking in terms of the Goliath companies that generate news that we can leverage, always an advantage for us, and particularly in a crisis. Why? Because coverage goes back to companies we know in a crisis. What's the effect on them? So there's heightened emphasis on covering like a Tesla. And the newsjack. How can we look at keyword terms, certain phrases related to your industry or your topic? How do we leverage that to insert ourselves in that conversation? So here are 3 types of rapid response. The slingshot is competitor response. The Goliath is related company response. The newsjack is topical response. How do we actually leverage each of those to become more relevant in a crisis? Okay, so that's another channel as well. That's sort of a PR-driven channel, but it's also incredibly important in a crisis. Basically, like, let's not let competitors get in front of us because 8.5 out of 10 market leaders are no longer going to be market leaders. Number 5, influence the influencers. So specifically, there are scalable relationships, and not all relationships are created equal. Whether you're in an industry that is covered by a lot of analysts, whether there are certain journalists or certain gatekeepers that have an oversized impact on our brand perception, those kind of relationships are great to scale in a crisis. And why? Because everything is in such disarray, people are more open to conversations. Other folks that are, market leaders, like, they've just had layoffs and furloughs. So developing those relationships in a crisis are hugely important. And certainly we have one now, and we're all working from home. We're all kind of socially disconnected. What we have found for ourselves and our clients, people much more open to having meetings and conversations right now too. So here is an example of an influencer relationship pipeline where we look at and we track stages of, our people, are they just reporting what we do? Are they receptive to what we do? Are they amplifying? Are they supporters? Are they advocates? Are they going from normal to familiar to interested to positive to effusive? So we will track our relationships, and for those of our clients, with analysts, with journalists, with influencers, and move them between stages and improve our relationship over time. So that's a powerful thing as a way. Basically, start to influence those influencers. You can move that forward to great effect in a crisis. And that's also, by the way, if you have valuable data or insight, that is also useful in developing those relationships. Relationships get developed because you can deliver and demonstrate value. And the key for a lot of companies doing this is you just have to first think, not what value do I receive from this relationship, but what value can I give? How can I impart value to everyone I talk to, everyone I have a relationship with? And if you do that, then usually the value comes, and also it's just fantastic business karma. And if you like people, and if you like connecting with people and finding ways to help each other, then it's a lot of fun as well. Right, so what we do is we will do 360-degree activity tracking. So we'll look at, okay, the people that we want relationships, how can we track what's their social feed look like? What is the content they're producing so we can enter the conversation? And this is an example of something we do. For instance, Lauren Good, who is a reporter for Wired, how do we move our relationship with her from reporter to receptor to amplifier to supporter to advocate? This is an example we did for client. How do we do that, and how do we track that? Really powerful in a crisis as well. Our recommendation overall is to focus on, if we could, about 40 key relationships. We've done a lot of sort of trial and error on this. 10 is too few, right? Not every relationship pans out. 100 is too many. If you're trying to cultivate 100 of those, it's just difficult because your focus gets shifted. So we think 40 or top 40, or your friendly 40, whatever it is, will be a great goal for that. So that's number 5. And Jackson, any other questions or comments or thoughts on this? I know you kind of live and work on this every day. And in case you're wondering, like folks like, Jackson's an account director with our company, highly strategic, both, worked in-house and with agencies across your entire career. Any other kind of thoughts on how we kind of influence the influencers?
Yeah, actually, Jordan Anderson has a really interesting question here. And I think it relates to a question of kind of influencers, but also kind of more generally in social media. How is it that you manage to maintain engagement during crisis times when there are so many competing voices?
I see. Great question. And I think one of the things we have a mathematical formula for this, actually. So here's the formula. And actually, by the way, Jordan, if you haven't seen we went into this a little bit more depth in our second webinar called How to Become a Thought Leader During Crisis Times. But here's the formula. Simple plus surprising plus significant equals high viral velocity. Or another way to put it is break through the noise. Let me break that apart. So simple. Basically, like you said, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of competing voices. Even if your idea is brilliant, if it is not simple, you often are starting with not enough mind share and attention from your audience to be able to impart your idea quickly. So simplicity is automatically a prerequisite because they're just not that focused on you to start. Surprising, whether you're B2B or B2C, people think they've seen it before. Oh, isn't this company like the Uber of blah, blah, blah? Yeah, aren't you like that one company that was like back there in the year 2005 and they used to do deliveries of this and that and they kind of went out of business? No, you're not like that. So surprising is you've got to break the expectation in some way. And then significant, say something deeper, say something of greater importance. So the way we do this in breaking through the noise is like literally, it's like the checklist. Like, okay, we're doing a LinkedIn post. Is it simple? Can you understand it? Is it surprising? Is there something unexpected, right? Like for instance, we came out with our webinar and we had some LinkedIn posts about it on pivot, don't pause, right when everyone was saying pause, right? Right when everyone was like super defensive, we're like, no, don't do that. That was a little bit surprising. Significant. How do we say something of deeper, greater purpose? So that's our checklist if we're doing a LinkedIn post. That's our checklist if we're doing an email communication. That's our checklist if we're doing a digital ad. That's our criteria if we're doing something on broadcast. That's our criteria if we're doing a PR pitch, right? So simple plus surprising plus significant equals basically standing out from the crowd. Brings us to point number 6, bolster your brand reputation. And Question is this: how much business do you lose from legacy reviews and comments that don't even reflect your current product? For those of us that kind of come from like a sort of a Silicon Valley version of startup, very popular ideas like a lean startup or having a minimum viable product, right? The idea is you don't have every bell and whistle, every feature when you launch. You have something that just like gets you in the market. So you can launch, keep a timeline and get feedback and learn and iterate. Well, the problem is you do your minimum viable product and a bunch of people start talking about it. And they're like, you don't have feature A, you can't integrate with B, you don't have an API that works well, C, and it's all this stuff. And you're like, hey, hold on. As like minimum viable product, this stuff is coming. Time passes, 2 years later, you got all that stuff. You've checked that off, but the problem is all of the discussion online reflects the product it used to be. And that's costing you business. So a crisis is a great time to do a few things. So one, respond to negative criticism, right? What happens in these crisis times is lots of marketing departments have been cut. So, maybe before your competitors would have chimed in on your comment. Now they don't. So let's not let negative criticism be a record of truth online. Two, let's enter competitor discussions. In a crisis, competitors are taking their eye off the ball. So, this is something that we did for a competitor, like you can see Grasshopper for phone service, a competitor that we were working with. Let's enter their discussion. Let's comment on all of those. Three, let's answer product questions. So let's build this out and let's build out kind of answers to that. So what we're doing now, and this is something that we do for our clients, we'll go through like 100,000 different forums, and we have tools that help us aggregate that, figure out what are the ones that are most important we need to respond to, whether that's Quora or Reddit, or it's an industry specific forum or comments or blog posts or whatever it might be. So don't let those stand. And it's a great time to advance that in a crisis, specifically because others are taking their eye off the ball. You can solve a lot of those problems. Okay, so these are the kind of things that we monitor as the agencies in the top network. And by the way, I should say that TOP, it stands for Test, Optimize, Perform. So we totally believe in taking an analytical approach to that. We look at Q&A sites, we look at curation sites, we look at specialty forums, and we're using that to change the perception of our clients. Brings us to number 7. Trigger prospects to buy now. In my second webinar on how to become a thought leader, one of the things I talked about, as well as the Pivot Don't Pause webinar, is how do you actually target those that have a psychological disposition to do business now? There's different kinds of companies, right? There are some that are in a defensive crouch, right? They're just not doing any kind of deals. No matter if they're a great fit, no matter if the industry is a great match, they're going to be hard to convert. But there are other companies, instead of doing the crouch, that are like, we're going in, right? We're bold, we're aggressive. So they're like they're counter for others in their industry. So one, we love those companies. And then two, and then third, let's talk about those who are like defensive in some areas, but then they're strategically advancing, right? Like they're doing both. So those kind of companies. So how do we look and talk about triggering those prospects, and what can we do to add some time sensitivity to convert those sales and those deals? So here's an example I want to give of some work we did for Postmates. And it was called the Postmates Challenge. And the goal was, can we get 1,000 new users to download the app and buy something in a single day, and we can't use paid ads? That was the challenge, right? So no paid ads. We just have to use triggers in ways to do this. Here's what we came up with. We leveraged something which is a real holiday called National Eat What You Want Day. And a little known holiday. And we used it by basically saying, whatever your city wants to eat most, Postmates will buy and deliver for free. Why did we do that? Well, whatever that is, if it's buying like a burger or it's buying something else like a taco or something else, it's a super cheap customer acquisition point for Postmates, because usually to acquire a customer, it's like a lot higher than doing that. So if they could acquire a new customer for this price of this delivering us whatever this top ranking thing is, they do it all day long, right? And then it allows us to have a few different triggers. So one, there's a location trigger. We're talking about a local metro market. So we're doing like whatever Houston wants to eat most, we're going to deliver. It has a time trigger. It's a national holiday. It happened in a moment in time. So that causes a target or a lead to need to take action at that moment. So we need a sense of urgency. Why? Because if we don't have the urgency, they got other things going on in their life, they're going to forget about it. And third, we had an emotional trigger. So it's like what you want to eat. What do you want to eat most? And by the way, this is a B2C example because we showed a lot of B2B examples, but you can do this on a B2B sense as well. So it's not so much the trigger and the emotion is just like the product, but it's like, what's the emotion? Like, you're going to look fantastic in front of the board, right? You're going to be able to move this metric that's going to totally change your growth trajectory. You're going to, get a promotion. These are all emotional triggers, even in the B2B sense, that we can trigger as well. So these viral triggers created compelling local news. And here's an example. ABC Las Vegas and ABC Tampa, they're doing like the most craved food. And by the way, a little trivia, basically in every city, it was like a Big Mac. People really crave a Big Mac across the board. And so we knew that we were going to deliver a lot of McDonald's, right? So the evening news is running this. They're running the coupon code on the air, and these are all unpaid, right? By creating these kind of triggers. Here's another thing. The newspapers, the Charlotte Observer, the Courier Journal in New Jersey, they're running stories and headline news that Postmates wants to give you a free Big Mac today. Again, unpaid, all free advertising. Influencers are doing it, whether it's Chicago Foodie Sisters talking about this, they're talking about this. And then online media, so places like heavy viral sites are saying, hey, there's a way to get a free Big Mac today. So looking at that, in this one campaign with triggers, in a single day, 60 plus media outlets, 20 plus TV stations covering it all without buying an ad. 14 major US metro markets. And by the way, we were focusing on 14 because those were the markets that Postmates wanted to acquire new customers in. 75 million impressions. And then overall, even if people were not even getting the Big Mac, there's a lot of positivity with the brand image. So the result from that in the single day was 10,500 clicks to a landing page. Basically, app downloads, new customers, 7,400. Big Macs delivered in a single day, over 6,000. And this was basically in the history of customer acquisition for them, like best day ever, because we added these viral triggers together. Okay. So Jackson, what have we learned here? We've learned that, and this is the major list. How can PR and marketing scale growth in a crisis? Number one, it builds up credibility via social proof. 2, we can warm up cold leads. We talked about LinkedIn and social as a channel. 3, we can become a category thought leader quickly, and how we can do that, and it accelerates it. 4, we can unseat a tough competitor by slingshotting around all of their news, piggybacking on it when they're taking their eye off the ball. 5, we can influence the influence. We can scale relationships. It's easier to do it in a crisis. 6, we can bolster brand reputation. Let's look at that online digital legacy we have. Let's increase it. We can accelerate that in a crisis. And 7, we can create triggers, emotions, virality to trigger action now. And those are 7 channels that if you deploy those in the next 2 to 3 months, you will see huge, enormous gains, not only in sustaining the ship right now, but also in Q3 and Q4 when we emerge from the crisis. It sets in motion. And again, the top 9% of all performers in past crises, there was 3 qualities they had. Number 1 was investment in marketing even during the crisis. 2, investment in R&D, so they're continuing to develop. And 3, investment in undervalued assets. And put another way, if you can navigate a crisis, deal with the short term, but also focus on the medium and long term, even as you do it, then you come out as a winner. So Jackson, any other questions or thoughts on that? What didn't I cover that I should?
Yeah, Ben, I think one question that we frequently encounter when it comes in particular to leveraging like holiday marketing, I'll often give the example of, for example, 7-Eleven having National Slurpee Day, or even pointing to clients we've worked with like Budweiser or Gosling's Rum. Obviously, these are large companies who are creating holidays for their brands, who have significant resources. When you're talking to maybe smaller brands or marketing departments with maybe not quite as much budget to spend on holiday creation or on activation around a holiday, could you kind of shed some light on how this can be sort of a cost-effective solution for organizations with less budget?
Okay, sure. I think one thing that we talked about is these kind of national holidays or weeks or days or months are underutilized as a marketing channel, because what's great about them is they have the built-in time trigger, number 1. And 2, they make you more relevant, because if it's, and this can even be for B2B, right? If it's like National Cybersecurity Awareness Week, and you're trying to market to clients, it gives you a reason for being relevant and a reason for being top of mind. So one, it's generally underutilized. But two, one of the opportunities, and we have like a little bit of a specialty in creating these viral holidays and these viral moments from scratch. And particularly what we do is we seed it with a certain group of influencers, we give it a social presence, and we give it a digital presence on a division of our company called National Today, where we actually at nationaltoday.com are the number one most popular resource in the world and the source of truth for what holiday happens on what day. So I think, for some marketing efforts where you don't have budget for full PR programs and you don't have budgets for full influencer marketing right now, or you don't have budgets for, you're scaling back paid digital or paid ads, national holidays, actually leveraging them. And for some of those programs, I mean, for as little as, kind of $3,000 to $5,000, we actually have programs that are drawing attention, and that it's an efficient way to go, because essentially, instead of spreading it out over a lot of activities, it concentrates it in a moment in time, and that can be really, really valuable. So a couple other things just to kind of finish up, and I'll finish up with my most important thought of the day. So one, love to hear from you. You can get in touch with me if you have questions, if you'd like to see a recording of the slides, if you're interested in working with us, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. That's my PR Hacker email. Also works, ben.kaplan@topagency.com. That's for the overall agency network. That's my email there, number one. Number two, here's the question I always ask. What is the one thing? Tweet at me, @Benjamin Kaplan. What is the one thing that you take away from this that was useful or helpful or interesting? We deal in what ideas are sticky. We like to know what ideas have a high viral velocity. Remember, simple, surprising, and significant. So what is the one thing you benefited or learned at? I will respond to you. So tweet it @Benjamin Kaplan. Let me know what is the one thing. And finally, as a little bit of a growth sort of networking hack to learn. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but one, there's my LinkedIn. So you can go to my LinkedIn page and welcome, just put in your note to connection request that you attend my webinar, and I'll accept. But also, if you have your phone with you, you can either take a screenshot of this on your computer or phone, or you can just hold up your phone, like right to this, like right now. And if you open up the LinkedIn app, if there's a little QR code there in the search bar, if you click that, there's something there that you can do that will say scan a QR code that will immediately connect you to me. And it's a handy thing to know for like a conference or when you meet people. So just click on that, scan a code, hold it up to your screen. And if you scan that, it will take you to my LinkedIn page. And I'd love to hear from you. And I'd love to connect. So that is crisis marketing. Those are 7 ways to accelerate your growth in a crisis. And the last point and most important point I'll leave you with is that what we do now for the next 3 months in whatever your company is or your brand or organization is potentially more important than the next 3 years. And in a crisis, not only is there a lot of disruption, not only is there a lot of uncertainty, but there's a lot of acceleration. And there's a lot of acceleration because essentially the playing field is redone. It's reset. So instead of having to move the pieces that exist on that playing field, everyone gets to start almost with a blank playing field. So anything you could do now to accelerate your marketing, to improve your thought leadership, to get more social proof, to remove the legacy of past products, to influence the influencers, to develop time triggers, to utilize these moments in holiday marketing, to create blueprints that allow you to be relevant to the current conversation, to leverage data and create data-driven content marketing programs that make you super important. Those are always good strategies, but it is especially important right now. And so this is the moment, this is the time. And if we look at the 2008 Great Recession, numbers of unicorn, billion-dollar companies emerged from that. Other companies had whole new levels of success after that. And that's going to happen here too. And I think it is a tremendous opportunity for the right kind of company. And obviously we're in difficult times right now, but it's also a time of great opportunity.
Fantastic. Ben, before we sign off, Nancy was wondering where she could find a link to the webinar or the slides for this presentation.
Okay, 2 things, Nancy. Number one, shoot me an email. I don't have a link for you right now. Just shoot me an email, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. I'll make sure you get that. And 2, I believe, and if you registered with Zoom, we should have set up an automated at least link to the video. You won't have the slides, but you can email me for that. That should come as well. But in any doubt, just shoot me an email right now, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com, and I'll make sure later today we get you the location of the video and these slides. And Nancy, question: what if you can type there in the chat, what kind of industry are you in? What type of interest do you have, so that we can tailor something for you?
So Ben, Nancy actually answered this question for us earlier. Nancy does PR and media relations in the healthcare industry.
Okay.
And she made some interesting points in particular about the importance of having highly relevant content during crisis times. So you very much in line with kind of your commentary here, Ben.
Okay, sure, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's cool, Nancy, is the relevance related to the individual, like it could be a reporter or influencer or producer or host. That could be really, really significant. What I mean by that is, like, let's say you're trying to get placements with the New York Times. Let's say you're in the health and wellness space. You can do health and wellness stories, but there's probably a relation of health and wellness related to family, parenting. There's maybe a relationship to health and wellness related to, are people going to start traveling again over the summer? So travel. Is there health and wellness related to technology? And what I always like to think about is relevant not just to like one of those, but many at the same time, because suddenly, as you know, instead of pitching 8 different reporters in health and wellness space for the New York Times, suddenly we can pitch 50 across travel and family and technology and all of that. So if we're more relevant in more ways, it gives us more opportunities. If we have more opportunities, we can expect in this PR example, more coverage. So with that being said, thank you so much, everyone. Shoot me an email, ben.kaplan@prhacker.com. Tweet at me at Benjamin Kaplan. Let me know your one thing, and would love to connect over LinkedIn as well. Thank you so much for coming, and I wish you all that kind of success in your crisis marketing. Cheers.